And I would still argue that public education is absolutely needed for a healthy democracy, and all kids deserve to be successful. The challenge, though, is that over time, I have worried that schooling has become much more of what we would call a sifting and sorting institution.
For all the talk about education reform, one truth remains. The system we have today wasn't built for the world we now live in. The structures, the schedules, the assessments, all of it was designed over a century ago for a society that simply no longer exists. So what happens when that system starts to crack under the weight of the present? And more importantly, what should come next? Today's guest, Dr. John Malloy, has spent nearly 40 years answering that question. As a former superintendent in both the US and Canada, he's led some of the largest and most complex school districts, from Hamilton Wentworth and the Toronto District School Board to San Ramon Valley in California. He's been a teacher, a guidance counselor, a principal, a district director, and a district superintendent. And now, as assistant executive director at AASA, he's working to support superintendents across North America in reshaping education for the future. So I really wanted to have John on the podcast because his perspective is quite rare, not just because of his leadership experience across multiple systems, but because he understands how deeply the origins of education still shape us today. In our conversation, we trace the evolution of public schooling, why outdated measures like the Carnegie unit and standardized tests still dominate, and why we need to shift from an industrial model of education to one that prioritizes student agency, curiosity, and problem solving. We also discuss the unique strengths of the Canadian education system, the role of the humanities in fostering civic responsibility, and why he believes student voice and leadership should drive the next wave of transformation. This is Education Matters, and I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. So let's dive into a discussion with the one and only John Malloy. Mr. John Malloy, welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
I am in Northern California in a sunny, warm place.
I know we've got lots to talk about, so I want to jump right into it. But before we begin in earnest, can you kind of give an overview for the audience about the work you've done in the past and the work you're currently engaged in?
I'd be happy to, Jason. So I have been a leader in education for many years, for a long time in Ontario, Canada, both in Hamilton, Ontario, and in the Toronto District School Board, of course, in Toronto. And 4 years ago, I moved to Northern California, where I became the superintendent of the San Ramon Valley Unified School District, which is the director of education for some parts of Canada. And then most recently, this last month, I moved from the San Ramon Valley Unified School District to the American Superintendents Association, AASA, as an assistant executive director, focusing on learning and leadership networks, predominantly for superintendents and their teams. So it's been an exciting experience.
I thought you were going to say it's an exciting experience over these last 40 years, which I'm sure it has been as well.
Well, it is 38 years to be exact in education. When I started teaching as a high school English teacher in Cincinnati, Ohio, and then became a guidance counselor for a number of years, and then moved into school administration. At this point, I was already in Toronto, Canada. And then to see education from so many different vantage points. And I even spent 2 years of that 38 working at our Ministry of Education in Ontario, which provided even a different policy and political perspective. So I feel very fortunate to have connected with education in a lot of different ways over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you're already kind of queuing into where I want to go. But I'd like to start by even rewinding the clock back a little bit further. I really want the audience to get a sense of how a lot of the folks in the education space that have been very influential over the years, how they grew up, what was influential to them as they grew up. So can you give us a sense of where and when did you grow up?
So I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and you can tell from having almost 4 decades in education, I was born in the early '60s, and the United States at that time, like many parts of the country, was really challenged and really divided and
Mm,
really intense. So sometimes when people talk about present situations as being so intense, I remember that this isn't new necessarily. And certainly when I was first on this earth, it was an intense time. And early on, my upbringing taught me to be concerned about others and to try to
mm,
make things better for other people. And because I loved school, I absolutely loved school, even as a
mm.
young kid. I always thought that going into education would be the best way for me to give back and to make things better for others. So, as I said, Cleveland, Ohio, 1963 is where I started. Always wanted to be a teacher, never veered from that desire, and the rest is history.
What was it about school that pulled you in? What was it that you loved?
I loved connecting with the teachers and the other staff members. I appreciated being curious and I loved learning new things. So the challenge of school was way better for me than, say, some sports fields. I wasn't the greatest athlete, but certainly school was wonderful, and I got attached to it. Now, interestingly enough, though, because of my experience in school, I've had to, over the years, really engage closely with kids who have the opposite experience or a difficult experience of school. Because my worry is that education tends to attract a lot of people like me.
Mm,
School was a good place. School was a safe place. School was a happy place. And a lot of our kids don't communicate that to us. And
mm.
so I think that that's something that we always have to pay attention to when we're thinking about our role in education.
Well, yeah, and I don't think I would describe loving school, especially early on. I think I learned to love school. But there is one thing that I ask everybody that I think is common to every member of our species, and that at some point you love learning something. What was the first thing that you remember loving to learn?
I loved learning how to read.
Mm,
And because I loved learning how to read, I read and read and read, which again, I know is part of why I love school because you can't go to school without reading. And then I loved learning how to express my thoughts in writing. And I can remember being in first and second grade writing my versions of a novel because I just didn't want the story to end.
mm,
And then math. I mean, back in the day where multiplication tables were all the rage, and frankly, I would suggest they're still important now. I just loved be able to communicate to everybody all the multiplication facts I had learned. Anyway, always excited about just those new ideas. But more importantly, it's because it opened doors. You
mm,
see, like the reading opened doors to new ideas that I didn't necessarily have access to, or writing gave me an opportunity to share my voice in different ways that I had never thought about before. And those things, again, always drew me, and I was
mm.
excited about it. But as I say, so many of the kids I've taught over the years and have connected to over the years, they don't feel the same way. They found reading to be hard and they found
Yeah.
writing to be boring, and math they might not even want to consider. And
Mm.
so I have to always share, to my educator friends and colleagues, we got to keep that in mind too.
Yeah, I think that the true tragedy comes in when students, kids don't really develop early on that addiction to new ideas, that kind of feeling of what a new idea does to your whole body. Is there anything about your upbringing that you wish children today could experience?
I think when you talk about curiosity, I loved that curiosity came from all the things I got to do in the world. You know, I'm not going to sound like the dinosaur here, But we didn't have any technology. There was no phone. There was no social media. There was a TV set with a couple of channels. And so we didn't have a lot of choices. So, number one, as a family, we gathered around that TV a lot, which led to conversations, which led to newer ideas. Because that TV got a little bit boring after a while,
Mm-hmm.
we explored outside. We played outdoors. We were engaged outdoors with others in our community. And that I loved. We were able to take our bikes everywhere and anywhere. Now I am starting to date myself because you know darn well that doesn't happen to
Mm-hmm.
that degree anymore. And so we got to see, even though our community was small, it wasn't small to us. We got to get on that bike and cross big roads and see friends in other parts of the community and experience life as small as I can reflect now.
Mm-hmm.
It was big. And then it allowed us to connect with different people. It allowed us to learn new things. I worry that our kids don't get outside enough. I
Mm-hmm.
worry that our kids are too attached to their phones. And I worry that kids don't know how to relate to each other the way we were taught to relate to each other because they're more attached to virtual connection than real connection. And I will never regret the sense of neighborhood
Mm-hmm.
that came from those connections that I don't always hear young people talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if I could add to that, those connections were also, in my experience, made possible by the sense of freedom with that bike. For me, when they let me ride all over the neighborhood, um, that sense of freedom is what opened me up to new community, to friends that I wouldn't see because they didn't live around the block.
Right.
And I'm trying to instill that in my kids. And I have the feeling that there's a bit of a renaissance coming with folks, in terms of how they're raising their children and giving them that freedom. So with that, John, would on the flip side of that, I should say, is there anything that you would have changed about your own education, knowing what you know now?
I'm in a very unique spot when I'm going to answer this question because I have
Mm-hmm.
to say that I wouldn't,
Mm.
because I always
Mm.
followed my heart in learning new things. So I loved writing and I loved reading. So it was natural to become an English teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I got to know kids and I hopefully created a safe space in my classroom, they started sharing things with me that I was not equipped to help them with. And that drew me into
Mm.
becoming a counselor. So I studied counseling and got a master's in that. And then I became a guidance counselor. And when I was in that space, I loved the ability to touch, all kinds of the aspects of the whole child. But I was sometimes concerned that I couldn't change some of the structures that
Mm.
were actually causing some of the anxiety that I was dealing with in my counseling office. So then I went and studied administration, and into administration that I went. And then as time went on, I felt like I was more excited about systems change. And then I
Mm.
moved into the district office. Where I'm going with this, Jason, is that I followed my passion as I learned new things. And so the path to my formal learning, as well as my informal learning, has always been in response to a need I was seeing, a change I wanted to be a part of, or an innovation I wanted to help create. Like when I think about some of the work that we were doing
Mm.
15 years ago in the technology space, when I didn't really have a clue about technology to the degree I needed, but I learned because I relied on people who did.
Mm.
I realized our kids were not getting access to some of the things they needed in the district I was leading at that time. And so I found people who knew what needed to be done, partnered with them, and through that process, I was able to learn. So, all that I say to everybody who will listen is have an open mind, understand what you're passionate about, and don't
Mm.
be afraid to engage in topics and ideas that you have no clue about, because that's just going to make things that much richer for your leadership, for your
Mm.
contribution, and in our case, with education for our kids.
It's interesting that you phrase it like that, John. It almost sounds to me like your uh, your leadership is a byproduct of your interest and your desire to help others. Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely, because when I set off on this career in 1986, I had no intention of ever leaving the classroom. And for
Mm,
all of those who might be listening who are classroom teachers, you have an amazingly important, absolutely brilliant role. And I loved it. And I stayed in that classroom for a number of years, but it was my passion to do different things,
mm,
to change lives and to change opportunities that drew me to different roles. But I had every intention of being a classroom teacher for my entire career. And it just didn't work out that way. And I'm grateful for every opportunity I've had along the way.
What advice would you give to teachers that might hear a calling to be in administration?
So I truly believe that as long as our educators are willing to be of service, they're willing to share their passion with others. They're willing to work through really sometimes complicated human dynamics. Then please come forward. The however is some might think that leadership, especially in schools, is one of position or authority,
Mm,
maybe even power. And though I will never argue, when you take on different roles, there is a level of responsibility that comes with it. But the driver has to be that passion for change, focused on service to help students and staff and the entire community be the best they can be. And it's not always easy, which is why that passion has to drive it, not some belief that the position or the authority is okay, because it
mm.
really isn't sufficient.
If we can pivot a bit to gleaning your experience over these 38 years, I appreciate you correcting me there. I don't want to give you 2 extra years just yet, but I'm certain you'll get to that 40-year mark very shortly in the work you're doing now. And if you could describe for us, maybe the most inspiring things you've seen across all these jurisdictions, and it doesn't have to be one thing or one classroom, but can you kind of paint a picture for the audience as to what are the things that you've seen that you wish the entire world could see?
I have always been inspired in every single community I have worked in for the entire almost 4 decades that when we, as the educators, the adults, create space for young people to share their passions, their strengths, their interests, and their needs, what they share with us is so powerful, and it motivates transformation, and it drives purpose as long as we let young people and their voices and experience fill the room.
Hmm.
And as the adults or the educators, we respond to that. We are inspired by that. But no matter where I've been, when we create the conditions for young people to share their experience, brilliant stuff happens. The other thing that I would say has been an experience that I cherish is that whenever leadership is truly shared in an educational space, what I mean by that is not where the person with formal authority just delegates
Hmm.
responsibilities to someone, but rather everyone's expertise and experience matters.
Hmm.
Everyone's voice, as unique and diverse as it is, has a place at the table. And when those conditions are present, again, brilliant things happen. Sometimes, unfortunately, that doesn't happen systemically. That
Mm-hmm.
happens in places, but I truly believe those ingredients are necessary. And thirdly, big systems, districts, school boards are hard sometimes to move. They are built on tradition, culture, history. And What I do find, though, is when a community, both the elected officials, the parents and caregivers, the students and the staff, all understand that we need to drive together to either address a problem or to bring about a change or to tackle an issue. When that synergy exists, change does happen. The challenge is getting to that synergy is oftentimes very complicated. But I would say those are three experiences that I have had over the course of my career that demand certain conditions to be present. And then when those conditions are there, really great work follows.
So then, closely related follow up to those conditions. In your view and experience, what do the best classrooms look like, sound like, feel like?
Jason, it's so ironic that if I walk into a classroom and there's a lot of energy and activity and maybe even noise, the teacher will look at me and say, I'm so sorry, we're just in the middle of an activity. And I'm like, why are you apologizing? So, point number one is there's this myth that still exists that a quiet classroom is important. I get worried when I walk into a quiet classroom. So, that's point number one. I
Mm.
want to see a classroom where students are working together. So, that sense of teamwork and collaboration. I want to see a classroom where students have the ability to explore things in different ways. There's not one right way of doing it. I love classrooms where students are assessed in different ways. There's not just
Mm.
one test or one quiz, but rather students' strengths can actually be observed and they can be addressed in the way in which they are assessed, and that there's choice. So if this teacher is really trying to help the students engage with certain curriculum standards, the students get to choose how they're going to approach that. So there's not a one size fits all. Now, don't get me wrong. There are times when the teacher needs to bring the whole class together and to assist the entire class to understand a concept and to think about that concept in an initial way. But then from that starting point, I'm looking for classrooms that have that level of engagement, that level of activity, which means it's not going to be a quiet place at all.
Mm. Mm. So you've mentioned a few times like the kind of structures that need to be moved, the origins of our education system. And I do want to get there because in our conversations leading up to this recording, it dawned on me that you're not only such a wealth of experience, having lived in the classroom and in the administration across multiple jurisdictions, but that also you have a real strong sense of how the origins of education came to be, how the public's education system came to be. And I do want to get into that, but I don't want to leave this conversation without asking someone that has such a unique view of the North American systems about Canadian education. In your view, John, as correct me if I'm wrong, you're that rare and coveted dual citizen, right? U.S. and
Yes.
Canada, right? In your view, what is unique or special about Canadian education?
Well, I think there's a lot of really important aspects of Canadian education that we can highlight. First of all, our Charter of Rights and Freedom talk a lot about the importance of the community and the community coming together to be better. And that when we think about what we value, when we think about what we cherish in Canada, it is about certainly individual rights, but the power of the community, the voice of the community matters. And to that end, public discourse and debate and dialogue is so very important. And I would trust that the Canadian context will never lose sight of that.
Hmm.
So that is foundational. The other thing I would say is really significant, and I can speak for the Ontario context because I didn't work in any other jurisdiction in Canada. And as you know, in Canada, the provinces oversee education. But for close to 20 years, I was able to live, lead, and work in a province that community, schools, and policy, all the way to the government through the school boards, was aligned. Now, some people don't like that word aligned. And I don't mean aligned in a rigid way. It just means that what was happening in our classrooms and schools was being communicated to the decision makers. And what was coming back to our schools and our districts and our school boards from the political body made sense. And in that, we had access to world thinkers and leaders and practitioners about how to help kids learn better, how to help kids grow, think, create, collaborate. And we became better for it, and the world took notice. I mean, for decades in Ontario, we were seen as one of the best education systems in the world. And I always say to people when they ask, it didn't happen by accident. Prior to that time, and I would say it started around 2002, 2003, we were good teachers working in really good schools and I think really good school boards. But we were all kind of doing our own thing. Not to say that was terrible, but I don't think it brought about the same outcomes. When we got into that new way of working and leading and teaching and learning together, it was really energetic and motivating. And we learned a lot and we changed our practice. And that's where I realized when you get everything working as it should, there's an organic energy that takes over and it does make a difference. And so my experience in Ontario, which is my Canadian context experience, saw that we could really work together for the betterment of students, and we actually have the evidence to prove it.
Do you feel that any of that has changed over the last, say, 5 to 8 years?
What I'm finding across every jurisdiction, both Ontario and across Canada, and now that I'm in the United States, is that I do believe we are struggling to understand what is the next chapter going to look like. How are we going to ensure that our kids are going to be amazingly effective in a world that we can't even understand what's coming? And how does our public education paradigm need to change in order to meet that need? I would say that we were struggling with it before. I think that struggle is getting more intense. And I'm worried that school districts, school boards, political governments, etc., are not leaning into this transformational problem enough. And so that's my big worry, that yes, things have shifted. And just like my experience in Ontario in that 15 to 18 years, as I said, 2002 to beyond, we all figured out what we needed to do together. And then the policymakers, the practitioners, the researchers, they all got onto the same page. And then our access to supportive practice and to coaching and to effective understanding of what kids needed, it all had, as I said, that connected experience. We're going to need to do this again, because I think as our world changes, we're not changing along with it in public education, and I'm worried about that.
Well, I think that's actually an excellent point to now segue into at least a relatively brief discussion about the origins of public education. Because I think if we look back to the key philosophical and societal drivers of the establishment of public education, it might shed some light on what we need to do at this pivotal point. So can you give the audience an overview of those key philosophical and societal drivers that helped establish the public education system as we know it?
And I'm going to speak about what it was intended to do, and then I'm also going to offer from my own experience what it sometimes did. But public education was intended for a number of reasons. First of all, to give all young people access to the world of learning. It was intended to be a cornerstone of a healthy democracy. It was intended to provide all young people with the opportunity to be successful. And so the public education system, when it did become eligible for all, because remember, we've also had, different historical pieces where not all young people had access to school. But once it was very clear that we were all going to be in school, it was for that purpose. And I'm grateful for that foundation. And I would still argue that public education is absolutely needed for a healthy democracy, and all kids deserve to be successful. The challenge, though, is that over time, I have worried that schooling has become much more of what we would call a sifting and sorting institution, meaning you have these capabilities, you're going to college. You have these capabilities, you're going to go to the trades. There's nothing wrong with the trades. There's nothing wrong with college. I'm not making that point. My point is it started at very early ages to sort kids into who was going where. And for decades, that kind of industrial approach to schooling, which was always about getting kids ready for the next step. Elementary prepared for middle or junior high for high school for the world after. All of that became very much a part of our public education lives. Then we decided what mattered and what we valued. And that's where the whole standardized test movement came, where we measure certain things. And there's no argument that reading is important. But what about the other things we should be measuring, like creative thinking, critical thinking, and such? So the whole standardized test movement, which does do some things, also limits us in public education. And then, because again, the panacea was that kids were going to be prepared for university or college, then we got into this notion of how much seat time turns into a credit, how many credits are required in individual subjects in order to graduate, and then what grades you got determine what your grade point average is, which coupled with your standardized testing or college admission type testing like ACT and SAT, you then got into hopefully the college of your choice. So that whole industrial model, that sifting and sorting, has been around forever. And yet our cornerstone is that all kids deserve the conditions needed to be successful. And that's what I'm hoping we're going to continue to move again towards, because as this world changes, the industrial model of education is not going to work any longer. Innovation, technology, the speed of light and sound change is driving a different kind of learning, a different kind of relationship to what success means. And our standardized processes are probably not going to cut it. So I'm predicting that over the next short while, even though we've been talking about change for years, there will be no choice but to change.
So you mentioned that shift, at least at a high level, from the industrial to, I guess, what we can call the information age. How do you see the goals shifting along with that societal shift?
We know that if our students graduate from our schools being amazing learners, flexible, adaptable, capable, able to take on new things, able to synthesize difficult information, able to bring ideas together and create something new, able to bring those ideas to a group and persuade and influence and be impacted by what others have to share. Everything I just shared is absolutely necessary now and in the future. If you look at any Fortune 500 company, if that's what you're interested in, they're going to actually describe what I just said. But what do we test? Not those things. And so what was previously the sign of success, grades, grade point average, and where you went after high school, Now it's going to be how you think, how you
Hmm.
collaborate, how you create, because that adaptability is what is going to be looked for when our young people enter the workforce, when our young people are trying to create amazing communities, dealing with any problems that you can think of. It's going to be those skills that are necessary.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, we're not there yet, Jason, but
Yeah.
that's where I think this is all going.
Well, there's a bit of a practical issue there, though, right, John? Like those things that you mentioned, important, and I think our audience here for sure would agree with you. Um, it's difficult to measure in the same way that when information was sparse, you could measure how much information now this student retained. And that was a good enough proxy of being able to go out into the workforce and to be innovative and eventually do all the kind of stuff we know that's kind of built modern society as we know it. Is it is it a practical problem that we need to solve first, or is it a theoretical problem?
I think it's a practical problem, but I actually don't think the answer is that hard to find.
Mm.
Meaning, when we're working, our performance is usually assessed through observation,
Mm-hmm.
through someone who oversees our work, looking at our artifacts, understanding our process,
Mm-hmm.
looking at our outcomes. In fact, yes, you may take tests to get into medical school or to go into law, but we are seldom tested in that traditional way in the workforce, even though our performance is assessed. We are doing this already, but not necessarily across the board. But how teachers are listening, observing, asking, so that our kids can show us their depth, can show us their breadth, can show us their process, so we can assess their capabilities, not simply in a paper and pencil sort of way. So I think if you just use the metaphor of how our performance is assessed in the
Mm-hmm.
workforce now, it could give us a pretty significant vantage point into how we might think about assessment in a classroom.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. There is to me a bit of an issue, and I know you're not making a direct comparison between like workplace and education because there's a lot more things that need to happen, and you indicated earlier as to what need to happen in an education system for the development of a democratic society. One of the things that I know early on was part of all foundational teaching was sort of a broad background in the humanities and certainly in the Western traditions. And then, since its foundation, that's opened up to other traditions as well. Can you speak to the origins of that and why that was such a foundational part and still is a foundational part of our university programming, for example? So I know certainly as part of high school as well.
So this is getting back to my ideas around we intended as public education to be the cornerstone of democracy, but we slipped into a sifting and sorting mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why the humanities, in my opinion, are very important, why understanding civic responsibility is very key, is because there is way more to our lives, even though it's an important part, than going to work. Our lives are also about how we connect with each other. Our lives are also about the purpose that drives us. Our lives are also about the communities that we help shape and form. And to build up new ideas and build new relationships, as well as have effective and wonderful careers where we make a contribution and so forth. So if you really believe that life is about all of those things, then education has to actually help kids think about that, learn about that, reflect about that, not just the content of certain subject areas that then is assessed through a test, an exam, or a quiz. because that's not real life. So, yes, public education continues to hold out those values. But what we're up against is if it's believed that certain pathways through elementary, middle, and high school will lead to a post secondary college or university that then leads to a great career, I get how people are concerned about that pathway and want the best for their kids. But I worry that that pathway that sometimes gets held up as the value is back to the sifting and sorting approach. But
Mm,
at the end of the day, this is my litmus test. Great test takers
mm,
are not always the most flexible and adaptable learners. They might actually be good at memorization. And memorization alone is not going to be enough. So they might have the credentials that suggest they're capable of 1,000 things, but in essence,
mm,
that young person that may not have done as well on tests, may not have done as well in the traditional education format, but are so amazing in terms of their ability to learn, they could actually, in the world that's emerging now, be much more successful. So, where I'm
mm.
going with this is, Jason, yes, public education will continue to be the foundation of a healthy community and a healthy democracy. And we want our kids to be great learners. And we want them to develop in happy, healthy ways. And we want them to have a good career and an ability to support family and such. But there's a lot of ands in those
Mm,
statements, not
mm,
ors.
mhm.
And my worry is that we're still holding a definition of success that's very limited and isn't going to suffice as we think ahead.
So, having made that wonderful point and done it so eloquently, what would you suggest should be the primary focus of education reform, both in Canada and the US? And you might want to deal with those separately. You could deal with them together. But what would you suggest? Like, how do we get this reform going? Where do we put our energies into moving the system?
And I would say that for this question, I don't see a huge difference between Canada and the United States because kindergarten to grade 12 education is sandwiched between our amazing parents and caregivers who are the primary educators, and then the post secondary opportunities that our kids are striving for. And those two influencers play a huge part in what we're struggling with in terms of transformation. And I'll
Mm,
explain. In order for public education to provide some of the learning opportunities that I've just described, we need to work with our parents and caregivers who have a vision of what school should be that might reflect how they went to school, and it may not actually suffice for 2024 and beyond. So, working with our parents who might have a view of math, for example, which is very important, or a certain type of academics, for example, which I'm not negating, but this whole embracing a student as a learner and changing learning opportunities so that we help them grow as learners bumps up against some really significant perspectives on what school should be. And so I want to park that piece
mm.
because we need to do more work with our parents and caregivers to help them understand their children as learners, not just children who are there for the grades, for the tests, etc.
So
So
that
that's one
piece is
side.
a communication piece and education piece to the general public.
Communication, engagement, whatever you want to call it.
Mhm,
But we've
mhm,
got to help our parents be partners with us in what our students need.
mhm,
On the other side, we have this notion that is so hard and fast. And I won't go too far into the details, but the Carnegie unit has been around since 1909. And it basically defines, hours that students are in a classroom, in a desk, studying discrete subjects for a certain amount of time. They get a grade, they show they're capable, they move on to the next. That's not how life works either.
hmm.
Our lives are intertwined, interdisciplinary, if I could use that term. They aren't discrete subjects. And yes, there are important foundational understandings to every subject area. But the role of school has to be helping young people integrate those ideas, synthesize those ideas, not stay in standalone units. But our whole college and university admission process is attached to this view of education, which is why you sometimes have students studying fields or subjects they don't even actually enjoy because there's a belief that that's the only way they're going to get to the career, which is going to give them the type of life they're looking for. So where I'm going here is that we need to engage and communicate and educate our families in a new way of thinking. And we also have to change some structures that hold kindergarten to 12th grade education in place. Because when I'm trying to work with my staff on transformations, they sometimes rightfully say, but what about the standardized test?
Right.
Or what about kids' admissions into college and university? If we help the kids learn and grow in this way, will they be successful? One last comment. There is emerging evidence to suggest that when kids are able to think and learn, they actually do well on standardized tests and they do well in terms of post-secondary pursuits. But we haven't done this long enough for people to believe that. And that, I think, is another one of our challenges that's holding us into place.
Yeah, and we can come back to the standardized test because, I mean, we have AI that can test in a variety of different ways very soon. And whether that's what we want to be doing or not, it's just an example of it need not always be how it's been. And to that point, can you, for the audience that might not be as familiar, can you describe I believe you call it the Carnegie unit?
Yes.
Can you describe what that is and how it was founded?
Yeah, so I think that all of us, especially in high school, know that when you take a course, that course needs to have so many hours and it has to have so many days to reach those hours. And then you are assessed to ensure that you understand all those standards. And then when you pass, you move on to the next course. And so when you look at a student's transcript, there is a bunch of different grades.
And forgive
the
me, John,
Englishes, the sciences, and so forth.
Its origins. Because
So in terms of
that's the part that I think is really interesting for folks. Like, we've just always accepted that this credit and grade system is part of school, but
Right.
it has a specific origin that I think would be useful to describe to folks.
Well, as I understand it, the origin came from our colleges and universities telling us what kids needed in order to be successful in college and university. And that's where this whole notion of I've got to get my kids ready for elementary school. I've got to get my kids ready for middle or junior high. I got to get my kids ready for high school, etc. It all follows suit that it started with this is the best way to help young people be successful in college and university. And as you know, colleges and universities are also structured the same way. And if you're taking something interdisciplinary, it's oftentimes considered alternative, not mainstream. And when you look at how colleges and universities are structured, departments, courses, etc. So, Jason, the whole reason that we embraced the Carnegie unit, it was all about how we prepare students effectively for their post-secondary pursuits.
Post-secondary pursuits, John, in what era? Like how long ago are we talking?
Well, this was 1909 when this all came to be. So we're talking 115 years ago. And remember, at this time, students who weren't perceived as capable of college and university work, they were put on a different track towards different occupations that didn't demand college and university. So that was that sifting and sorting that I talked to you about. And so the Carnegie unit didn't necessarily affect them because back in the early 1900s, frankly, up until the mid 1900s, as long as you got to a certain grade in some communities, say eighth grade, you got into the factory as long as you were
Mhm.
a good kid who was
Mhm.
on time and was willing to learn whatever that particular factory did. So you weren't necessarily going to stay on the school path. You weren't going to continue your education because your path was taking you at a certain age right into the workforce. But the Carnegie unit was always about how we prepare our kids for college and university. And then those who weren't going to college and university, they were put on different paths and supported in a different way. And those are some of the things that over the last number of decades we've been trying to shift.
Well, and I appreciate you bringing up and giving that history because it is evident now, you know, over 13 years later, 14 years later, it's arbitrary, right? It's an arbitrary kind of measure and system that was created that sure may have had some utility over 100 years ago, but we've certainly outgrown it. Um, so, you know, I think that's one of the important things that, I want people to be aware of is that when we are challenging the system or we should challenge the system, because I think a lot of what we're doing, including the school bell, organizing students by age level, has
Yes.
just been something that we've inherited. And we think, and parents think, to your point about educating the parent community, that because it's always been this way, there's a really good reason it's always been this way. And I think a lot of that was for practical reasons 100 years ago. And a lot of those practical reasons don't exist today, or we can overcome them. So,
So just if I can just give you a
sure.
thought on that last one, because I think
Mhm.
you've raised a really important question. And let me give a little bit of an illustration to it. In some communities, if your child is in a 2-3 split class,
Mhm.
parents get upset, teachers feel stressed. Well, my kid is in third grade. They shouldn't be in a second, third split. But what I've always argued is in any grade as it's presently organized, there are all kinds of different learners, strong in some things, maybe challenged in other things. So there's no such thing in my book as a student in grade 2. There are students who happen to be a certain age and they are a continuum. Similarly, when we are so focused on content, of course, it's terribly difficult for a teacher to think about what am I going to do with my students in grade 2 when I've also got my students in grade 3 here. But if we think differently about the process, let's just
Mhm.
say that the process is one where it's more about inquiry or problem solving. Let's think about how the students can actually pick something they want to go deeper in. And that teacher then thinks about the curriculum standards from that problem based place, not a content teacher directed place. Then this whole
Mhm.
conversation changes. Another piece of evidence. When
Mhm.
students have the opportunity to support their classmates with something they've already mastered, they learn it better. Another value
Mhm.
to having creativity. When
I
kids
was
are,
gonna bring that up as well. That's a secret that only teachers know. That by teaching
it's,
something, you learn it
yes,
like you wish you had always learned it.
exactly. So where I'm going here is our model of education. I'm 8 years old. I'm in this grade. I study this content area. I get tested. I move on. Isn't serving us all the time.
Mm.
Please know, though, I want to be absolutely clear. Foundational skills are important. Kids
Mhm.
must know how to read. They've got to know how
Mhm.
to write. They've got to understand math. And we have to help them with all these other skills. So, yes, you can still do creative groupings of kids who need a certain program or intervention because the whole classroom isn't doing the same thing. The classroom is organized in a way that these 4 kids are working in this way, these 6 kids are working in that way. The teacher is intervening as appropriate. And again, as I say that, some people are going to say, they're going to roll their eyes and say, oh my God, that's so difficult. That's so hard. Talk to the teachers who've been doing that for years, and they'll
Mm.
say, trying to be the lead in a classroom with 30 young people for 6 hours a day, taking all the responsibility yourself, that's the part that's difficult. But
Mhm.
allowing kids the space to learn, to lead that learning with a lot of guidance, sometimes some direct instruction, that's a learning environment that's not only great for kids, but from what we're hearing, it's also really engaging for our
Mm.
staff as well.
Excellent. So on that note, John, looking at great pedagogy and what, perhaps a great classroom looks like. If I ask you to look forward now to the future of education, say long after you and I are gone, say 50, 60, 70 years out, what does that look like?
I'm hoping it's 5 years out, but we can go 50, 60. Um, I would love to see classrooms where we do have curriculum standards, where kids are expected to meet those standards, but the way in which we go about it reflects some of the conversation you and I are having. So, for example, kids being supported to move at their own pace, meaning challenged enough, but not so challenged that they disengage. Another thing that I'm thinking about is that the problem that a student wants to explore, the issue that a student wants to go deeper in, that is important and that is considered. And that students who have similar interests can gather around that problem together. So the collaboration isn't just, I'm going to put you four kids in a room together. The collaboration is, I'm going to invite you to go deeper with a problem. And then the teacher's job is to watch what's happening and to support that organic process by thinking about those standards and incorporating them in different places. Now, there should be times where kids are assessed. And some of the traditional assessments on occasion are fine. I just don't think it should be the only assessment. So, for example, I'm not anti-test or anti-exam. I just don't want it to be the only assessment that is used. But at the end of the day, my hope is that we care more about kids being learners and less about kids being test takers. And because we care about those kids being learners, we also help them be socially healthy, physically healthy, emotionally healthy, and that when they leave our schools, they then have the most amazing foundation to be able to move wherever they need to move going forward. That might sound idealistic, Jason, but I'm just hoping that, we're seeing glimpses of it in our schools,
Mm-hmm.
but we need to see a lot more of it.
Well, I asked the question to everyone because I firmly believe you have to know where you want to go in order to get there. So I appreciate your perspective on that. So my penultimate question for you: if you had a magic wand, what? And this is all powerful, John. I feel like people don't lean into this question enough when I ask them. You have an all powerful magic wand. What would you do to change the education system?
So I would want to get the education system to be so student centric, not just in name, that we think about everything that you and I have been talking about in terms of our structure, in terms of our process, in terms of our outcomes. And in order to do that, we've got to think differently about post-secondary. I'm just going to put it out there. I think that what our kids need in order to be healthy and successful in our world, and how our colleges and universities or our workplaces support that, has to be more reflective of what is happening now, not just what's going to happen 10 years from now. I worry that there's a chasm between what's happening in our world, driven with AI and technology, and then some of the global issues that are emerging. And then we're talking about a loss of friendship and relationship and family and connection. So there's a whole human dynamic we're worried about as well. Clearly, our drive, our obsession around content and academics, I'm not saying it's unimportant, but it needs to be balanced. So right now, as an educator for almost 40 years, we have this paradigm of what young people need in order to be successful in middle, in order to be successful in high school, in order to be successful beyond. Second, we have a paradigm that some families want to move their kids through fast. Like, why does a kid need to be 3 math levels ahead at age 9? Now, if they're great at math and they're excited about math, and they should be offered the opportunities to do math in whichever way they can. But where I'm going here is, this is a cultural paradigm of pushing kids down a path. So, to be really concrete, I would love for us to return to truly understanding who our students are. So that means a real interpersonal connection, which isn't always there right now. And from that place, parents and caregivers partnering with school staff, we plot a course that isn't standard for every young person. For example, in special education, we all know the importance of the individual education plan. Why is an individual education plan a special education thing? Shouldn't we all be on an individual education plan? And from that individual education plan, we devise learning opportunities. Last but not least, and I'm going to make it really simple, I've used it a couple times in this conversation. We've been talking about problem-based learning for 3 decades. And for those who don't fully know what that means, it usually starts with the teacher presenting a bunch of different problems for kids to solve, connected to the curriculum, standards, and so forth. Kids get some choice about which problem they want to solve. The process of solving that problem is as important, and in some cases more important than the product. The whole process of learning, engaging, and leading towards an outcome is observed. The teacher, as well as classmates helping each other, guide that process. And at the end of the day, the kids are thinking more, they're creating more, they're collaborating more. And when you talk about the kind of learning that's going to really make a difference, I want to see every classroom dealing with those problem-based learning opportunities where kids are working together at their solution. So that's where I take a big idea, like how do we help kids be all of this, and bring it down to a concrete strategy. More problem-based, another term that educators used is inquiry-based, where it means the kids are always thinking, always wondering, always asking what's next. And most importantly, creativity-based. In the culture that we are living in, we got to create new stuff that never existed before from things that don't necessarily add up to that something new. So creative thinking, entrepreneurial thinking, creating something from nothing is key. And I want us to see it in schools where we're giving kids the opportunity to do just that, to create something different from that which doesn't presently exist, because they've been engaged enough in the process that they want to learn what's next. They want to explore. They want to create and innovate. I don't know. That may sound like a lot of idealistic terms, but that's what I wish I could see in our schools.
Well, I gave you the magic wand, and I think you used it in a wonderful way there to paint that picture. So thank you for that. So last question, John. I know you're always into some very interesting stuff. What podcast, book, video, movie, or all of the above would you recommend to the audience?
So when I was thinking about, because I'm oftentimes asked that question when I'm doing things like this. And right now I have to admit that the last 6 months or so, I've been reading everything I can get my hands on related to artificial intelligence. But I haven't been reading it in books, or I haven't necessarily been reading it in podcasts. So there's not one title that I would necessarily share. However, what I do is I used AI to actually give me insights into things I should be reading. And so I've spent the last 6 months just trying to figure out, what is this? Where is it going? What regulations are required? What does it mean for schools? How can it assist us, such as tutoring or helping personalize learning experiences? And how could it possibly be challenging, which means that we're not allowing kids some of the right conditions to be better? So when I'm answering your question, I don't have one title or one podcast or one book, but I've been spending a lot of time, whether it's YouTube videos, whether it's research articles, whether it's things that pop up through an AI search. I've just been reading everything I can to figure out what this is. So that's what I've been up to.
Well, wonderful. And I did fully expect for us to get into that AI and education conversation. So maybe that's a topic for the next time. But John, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Great to be here, Jason.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.